Hey, and welcome into the Big Ten Huddle. I'm your host, JR, and we've got a lot to talk about going on in the Big Ten. New format here on the video. If you're watching on YouTube or Spotify or however you watch the show, we have a new little advertisement here next to me. If you guys want to see that, it kind of features some of the home field apparel and stuff. If you guys ever want to check that out, it'll also be where our graphics over here, where our graphics go and everything. We have a lot to get to tonight, and I got Zack Guggenheim here with me to talk about it all. Zack, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. You're repping Ohio State. I'm repping the national championship Westminster Theological Seminary. We don't have a
Wow,
football team, but we're champions of something.
there you go.
I
There you
think.
go. I think you're champs. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, champs to me.
Yeah,
Champs to me.
very champs in a very different way. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. We got a lot to get to tonight. We have the ACC settlement we're going to get to first. I do think there's some news there that pertains to the Big Ten, and I have a bit of a take. I wouldn't call it a hot take, but I have, kind of what this means for the future of college football, and I think that impacts the Big Ten. So I want to talk about that, and then I also want to talk about storylines of the Big Ten. Seems to be something people are talking about right now. We're not going to do obvious storylines. We're going to kind of talk about
oh,
maybe less obvious. I mean, all the obvious ones, you can read those online. But we're going to talk about some less obvious storylines in the Big Ten for 2025. And then Big Ten win totals. Those came out last week, Zach. We did not get a chance to get to them yet.
hmm.
And we are going to get to them. Should be a lot of fun. Let's see who's here in the comments section with us and talk about it all. John says Big Ten Huddle and IU Oregon tonight. Yes, got the IU Oregon game on right now over here to the side. Ohio State, Nebraska as well. I'll probably not get as much in the first half, but Zach and I are so known for going less than an hour that
we got a reason to be on time tonight and on
yes we do.
topic.
Yes we
So
do. Yes we do. What were you say, Zach?
well, I was just gonna say before you get to other comments, so like define like less known storylines.
Like, can Penn State win the Big Ten? Like,
Thanks, Jr. Thanks for that. Okay, I'm gonna go
okay,
rewrite
mine are
my.
less known. Zach did the obvious ones. I
No,
did
no,
the less
I'll
obvious
say I'll
ones.
think of other ones on the
Okay,
fly
no, you're
during
fine. Do
during
whatever
during
you did.
during the home field ad. I will write a new storyline.
Okay, all right. Do whatever you did. It's fine. It's fine. And look at that. John said he got his home field hat from their new drops. There you go. There you go, John. I hope you
Um,
used the link. If you didn't, send it back. Order it again. Just kidding with you. Just kidding. We got Caitlin here with us as the Illini are continuing to roll, recruiting up to number 5. Yes, yeah, actually, that was a really good episode I did
um,
last week with Juck on recruiting, and Juck was actually very complimentary of Illinois. I thought Juck might talk about maybe Victor Singleton would be somebody who could transfer or something like that, but he was not. He said he saw the commitment sticking, and he's really impressed with what Illinois is doing in recruiting right now. So yeah, they're getting good players. Brett Bielema, whatever you want to call him, he's doing a good job. Almost like Zach, he might be near a top 10 coach in the country. What would you say if I told you that he's
hmm.
a top 10 coach in the country? What would you say about that?
I think there's really good argument for it.
I would say he is.
Yeah, I think there's really good argument for it. I mean, what did we had him top 5 in our Big Ten coaches, and
Yeah, we had him and Signetti top 5. Um, we had Day, Lanning, Franklin, Burt, Signetti, right?
I just we keep calling him Bert, and it's
Yeah.
great. I love
There you
it.
go. Yeah, yeah. Fill up with the ILL, INI. There you go. Do the Burt signal. Actually, you can't really. I'd have to like get all this stuff off the screen to effectively do it. So I don't know if I could like scoot back or something and like.
Hmm.
Yeah. I apologize, Philip. It doesn't work well with the new format. I should have changed the format on you before you asked for that. Billy says, "Good evening, Billy. Glad you're here." And the Burt signal. Yes, the Burt signal. Put it up in the sky. That's what
Hmm.
we need on this show more than anything. Is a Burt signal. All right, Zach, you want to get to our first item?
Let's do it.
All right. The ACC settlement with. Oh, I gotta bring John's comment down. All right, here we go. The ACC Atlantic Coast Conference had a settlement with Clemson and Florida State. They have approved a settlement that would end their legal fights and change the league's revenue distribution model and revise their long-term costs for a school to leave the conference. Trustees at Clemson and Florida State both signed off on the deal meetings today. So essentially what's going on here is the ACC and these two schools have now come to a settlement. These two schools wanted basically for, to earn more money than the other schools in the conference, and they wanted less money to leave the conference. They got both of these things here. Maybe not to the extent of what they wanted right now, but overall, I would say it's a win for Florida State and Clemson. They are making more money based off the number of people that watch them. They are playing more games against Notre Dame, which should help with that as well. And then in addition to that, their buyout, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it a buyout, but their agreement to leave the conference is decreasing every single year. It is getting as low as $75 million, which is incredibly low compared to what it was at like $500 million or something like that. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it actually was close to 500 million.
Yeah.
It's getting much, much lower, especially around that time, which is also the time that the Big Ten TV contract ends, and around the time that the Big 12 contract ends, and also around the time that they're going to be reshaping the playoffs. So a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of kind of things working for Florida State and Clemson. I don't think they have to leave because of this, but I do think it does make it enticing for them and maybe some other schools to leave as well. Zach, could you see schools leaving still, or is this a situation where you feel like the ACC has done enough to stick together?
If I'm honest, this is like slowing a gaping wound. Like it's trying to put a tourniquet on a severed limb, and it's going to die at some point. They're just slowing it down, and it's essentially a slow, more silent death than a big loud one with your biggest bullies going kicking and screaming.
Yeah, from everything I read, it was the ACC kind of puffing their chest out like, yeah, we're going to maintain being a big conference and, being excellent and competing at the highest level for the past 70 years. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
What you've done is you've kept Florida State and Clemson happy for 5 more years. And the question is no longer now, will Florida State and Clemson stay? The question is exactly what Billy Tuesday asked here is, does anybody want Florida State? Does anybody want Clemson? Because it's no longer in, and I'm not asking that saying nobody wants them. I'm saying that's the question now. If anybody wants those two teams, there is a clear time when those two teams can leave. And also, well, I'll save this for my future part of it, but there is a clear timetable for when these teams can leave. And if the big conference or the SEC or even the Big 12 would want to pounce and try to get these teams to come over to their conference, there is a likely scenario where that could happen now.
Yeah.
In addition to these two teams, Zach, I think there are other teams who could also possibly be leaving the ACC and trying to get someplace else. There was the Magnificent Seven. Right? These were the teams that were threatening legal action. They were Clemson, Miami, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia, and Virginia Tech. I only have 6 fingers up, but
I think
there
you
was 7.
Florida State as well.
Florida State. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, I knew I counted 7 earlier. So there are 7 teams. They called themselves the Magnificent Seven. Of those teams, to me, the only one I would add to those 7, and it's not so much because I think they want to leave as much as I think it's another conference would want them, is Georgia Tech. Because I do think the Big Ten does want Georgia Tech. It would not be the flashiest move in the world for the Big Ten to add Georgia Tech from the standpoint of they are not the most prestigious university when it comes to their football program. They have some pretty good history, but overall, they are not a prestigious football program in the current day and age. What they would bring is they would bring recruiting from the state of Georgia. They are one of the only teams that are relevant in the state of Georgia. I forget, correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, but there's really only 2 teams in that state that are relevant. If you say Georgia Tech isn't relevant, there's only one team in that state that's relevant, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like this is less about Georgia Tech would want to leave, and it's more about the Big Ten, probably not the SEC, but the Big Ten would say, "Hey, we want to add Florida State. We want to add another team." I'm not saying they would want to add Florida State. I'm just saying if they would want to add those teams, they're going to want to add another team down there. Georgia Tech seems like the most likely scenario to do that. Your thoughts on other teams that might want to leave, Zach?
Well, and just a thought on that Georgia Tech. It's both the recruiting, but also the research dollars, because it's a very good high level academic institution, which is, I know the Big Ten has gone away from that a little bit, but it's still a priority in conference for big research institutions. And that's Georgia Tech is that. Um, do you mind if I just go back a little bit before I talk about other teams that might jump?
Sure, go ahead.
Because is it me, or is Clemson and Florida State essentially Texas and Oklahoma at this point?
I think yes, but maybe with a little bit less desire. Because I think Florida State and Clemson showed that maybe not so much Clemson, they still maintained at the top, but this last season for Florida State showed that they are impenetrable, right? Like,
Yeah.
they have the ability to just drop off and be a terrible team.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Texas has shown that. Not terrible, but they were actually
Yeah, they
were
didn't go
terrible.
2-10 though, right? Like I don't remember them
Yeah.
going 2-10. Like maybe
that's
6-6,
fair.
7-5, but not 2-10.
Yeah. So here's my point about that though, is that back when the first wave of expansion all the way back in 2010 happened, part of the reason why Nebraska and Colorado jumped ship was they hated Texas and how they were in charge of everything. It was both they saw the writing on the wall, but also they were sick and tired of having to deal with Texas being a prima donna in their conference. What's to say that anybody else is like in the ACC is going to be okay with this? Like I know ACC's puffing up their chest right now, but like in all seriousness, what's to keep the Pac-12, the old Pac-12 schools from saying we'd rather go back and join Oregon State and Washington State and reform the Pac-12 in some way? And I know people might say, well, the ACC has some stability. Does it really? Like, I don't think it has stability at all. I mean, it's like at this point, I don't see a team that would want to stay if they had an offer elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, with the way things are working out, and especially with how ESPN is treating the ACC as just essentially second tier football, like,
right.
I don't see why anybody would have this large desire to stay in the ACC. There are incentives when it comes to like basketball and other sports and stuff like that, but from a pure football standpoint, there really is no incentive to stay, especially if you're a Cal, a Stanford, like other than history and just maintaining the status quo. What probably is going to happen to the ACC is teams are going to leave and go elsewhere, and they will most likely combine with the AAC, and they will form some kind of American Atlantic Conference or something like that, right? Like,
yep.
And then they'll have Cal and Stanford in it, and it'll be like, how are you Atlantic?
Right.
But
and to that point, like the Big Ten schools are struggling with the travel financially, right? Like UCLA, USC has talked about that. Washington, Oregon has Phil Knight, so who cares? But if those schools are talking about it, Stanford's got to be talking about it. Cal's got to be talking about it. SMU has got to be talking about it, right? Like these are schools. Like SMU has to travel all over the place to be in conference. So like what advantage does SMU have? Like
I think
I don't know.
SMU moving up from the group of 5 to the power 4, like I think they're probably less into that as maybe some others are, just because of the opportunity it brings for them to be in the power 4, but your point stands. Like there are going to be others who are upset with what's going on. Zach, I do want to get to my future outlook, though, and get your opinion on it. So
Okay, go for it.
I have a theory with where this in the ACC could be taking us, and I want to present it to you, see what you think, and I want to see what the chat thinks. So it's a little detailed, but I'm going to do my best to try and piece it together so it's easy to understand. In my opinion, the ACC has changed things forever in college football when it comes to conferences in two ways. There are two ways. The first way is buyouts, right? We now live in a world where there are buyouts coming from a conference. You can buy your way out of a conference. This is different because before, the way you got out of a conference was you paid a fee that was essentially a fee that was agreed upon at the beginning. Now, what has happened is that fee, just like a coach's buyout, is getting lower and lower and lower as your time in the conference goes on. Teams will eventually get upset with other things that are going on as well in the conference, such as smaller programs, make their revenue is going to be based on smaller programs, audience watching them, not just them, but other teams' audience watching them as well. And so with a lower and lower buyout, these teams are going to want to get out of the conference and try to get someplace else. I think this is going to bring into play some kind of like contract situation, right? Where teams are no longer making money based off audience and how much teams are going to make based on how many people watch them. Because right now, that's what the ACC is saying. You will make more money if more people watch you. I don't think they're going to be okay with that, especially when it comes to trying to play games against Wake Forest, who does not have a fan base that is going to watch you very much. What I think this is going to transition into is in 2030, you're going to see, maybe not outright, but you're going to start seeing schools get into contract situations with schools rather than just become members and maybe, just kind of have this agreement that we're going to stay in the conference until the TV deal comes up. I think this could also turn into the way that maybe some schools have to leave conferences, right? And I'm not saying this will happen to this team. I'm just using this team as an example because they've not been very good lately. So Purdue fans, do not come for me. But say the Big Ten gets mad at Purdue and Purdue is not doing a good job with their fans. They're not doing a good job on the field. And the Big Ten goes to Purdue and says, here's a low ball contract offer. And Purdue says, no, we're not going to sign that. You're paying Ohio State this, and you're paying this other team this, and this other team this. We're not paying that. Instead, the Big Ten will say, well, you're not producing like these other teams are. So we're going to put you into an individual contract situation. This then dips into the revenue disparities as well because the teams are going to want to make more money and be given more money from the conference based on who they are as a team. What is your worth to the conference, right? This whole, well, you make 60%, this team makes 40%, it's not going to fly. I think that these conferences are going to sign teams to 4, 5, 6-year deal contracts and say, you're going to make this much each year. There's going to be bonuses in play if you make the college football playoffs, and there's going to be other incentives for these teams if they make the situation. This is all possible, by the way. It is possible for schools to be signed to contracts to these conferences. It's a little bit different than, say, the NFL and stuff like that because they don't have contracts for their teams, but this is something that could come into a play with how many different leagues there are in college football as opposed to the NFL where there's only one NFL. There's only one MLB. There's only one, name your sport, MLS, NBA, whatever there is, right? In this scenario right now with the NCAA dying, there is no overarching entity. Ohio State could go sign a contract with the SEC. Michigan could go sign a contract with the Big 12. Not saying either of those things are going to happen, but they could technically do those things. And then the other piece of this that goes into the revenue disparity is I think teams are going to start making money not just based on the TV deal, the national TV deal that they get from Fox, CBS, and NBC. I think this is going to start looking similar to the MLB. I think the MLB right now, teams share their national revenue from the TV contract, right? Teams
Mm-hmm.
share that. Every team in the MLB does. What they don't share are their local TV networks. And what we're seeing now is we are starting to see teams go against streaming, the streaming only options
Yep.
because it's affecting the local TV stations. Ohio State played, who was it this season?
Michigan
Purdue
State.
or Michigan State. It was only on Peacock. Well, now now what Ohio State lawmakers are trying to do, they are trying to outright ban streaming only options for Ohio State football. They're trying to ban that and say you cannot have an exclusive deal with a streaming option because their local TV networks want to have those games. So what you're going to see, I think, is okay, this game's going to be streaming nationally, but when it comes to local Columbus, TV network, 10 TV News, stuff like that, the game's going to be on there and it's going to be on streaming. That money that, Ohio State makes from 10 TV network and them playing that game, that'll go straight to Ohio State. They won't have to share that with anybody else. The streaming, they will share. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
So that's kind of where I see all this going because right now the ACC has completely opened the door to buying your way out of a conference, going to another conference, and also the revenue disparities. And I don't see this revenue disparity option lasting for the ACC. If the Big Ten tries it, it's not going to last. Ohio State's going to get upset by playing, not playing Oregon and Michigan and Penn State every single year. They're going to want to play those 4 teams because you make more money that way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you're proposing, I think it'll shift that way until the new playoff contract comes out. Because I think at some point, what you're going to find is what I think we've been saying for the past year now is this is all hurtling to something that's unsustainable if you don't regulate it from the top. And so the way that college football is organized now in the conferences it's unsustainable, which is why, as much as I hate it, it makes sense that the Big Ten and the SEC are kind of leading the charge because they have the most money, but they also have the most stability. And so Ohio State, we've talked about Ohio State ad nauseum here. Ohio State's not threatened by the other schools making equal money, right? That's why the Big Ten has been so successful across the board, is the big dogs don't insist on taking more than what their fair share is. And that is why Purdue and Rutgers and other smaller market or smaller tradition schools have been able to do really well in spite of the fact that they haven't performed as well. That's not the case for the ACC, but the ACC's opened the door for that type of thinking because it's not like the ACC is some deadbeat conference. Like they're the third best conference in college football. And Clemson and Florida State have both won national championships within the past 12 years. So it's, again, everybody wants to laugh at Florida State being terrible this year. But the reality is these are 2 big brands that can throw their weight around. And I think that signals that something bigger has to shift, whether it's a college football commissioner or, the NCAA actually does their job. The NCAA stinks. There we go. Trademark.
Yeah, but the NCAA, they're dead. They're not doing anything.
They're done. Yeah. So you need a commissioner, or you need to change from the top down how you do college football, which I feel like we've been saying for a while. But again, it's like the severed limb that we're trying to put tourniquets on. We just don't want tradition to die. And so, we keep putting Band-Aids on this thing. And it's like, guys, this is not going to last.
Right. Yeah. I do want to bring up what Philip said here because I did think about this and it's a good point. He said schools won't be able to afford conference buyouts because of revenue sharing in part. They won't be unless the conferences are going to help them pay it.
Mm-hmm.
You're telling me that, and I'm not saying Philip. I'm just saying like if the Big Ten wants Georgia Tech enough, the Big Ten will help pay Georgia Tech to get out of the ACC.
Yeah.
If the Big Ten wants Florida State enough, they will help pay for them to get out. Like
Yeah.
this is the and I'm not rooting for this to happen. Please don't get it twisted that I want this to happen. What is honestly looking like the best case scenario right now is that the Big Ten and the SEC get together, create some kind of league between the two of them, and work together. Because right now, with how money hungry everybody is and how TV is getting into college football, there is no other option
Yeah.
other than for schools to move around and try to find, wherever they can make the most money, primarily because of this revenue sharing. And if another conference is willing to help pay for Georgia Tech, Florida State, whoever it is, to get out of their conference and come to them, just like how the Mavs, pay for who got Billy Donovan out of Florida? Was it the Grizzlies or something? Whoever.
I forget.
Just like when they signed Billy Donovan away from Florida, he had a massive buyout. They paid it, right? Just like in soccer across the country, when you have to pay for a player to get out of it, they pay it.
Mm-hmm.
Or flip side of this, you don't have to pay it all at one time. You can pay it over time, and you can use the new money from your conference to help pay the buyout over 5, 6, 7 year period. This is where private equity could come into play.
Yeah.
So
you said something that I just want to comment on real quick, and then I don't know if you have other thoughts on this topic, but you said something that was really helpful, which is, and I think we miss this in this conversation, is when we're comparing college football to other leagues, we think of college football as one entity compared to the NFL, which is one entity.
Yep.
The problem with that is that these conferences have their own autonomy. And so it's not one league, it's 10 or 9 or however many. And they all kind of, it was like with the COVID year, right? With COVID, because the NCAA decided to stick their head in the sand, every conference got to determine their own COVID policies, which on one hand made sense because of how college football's always been. But it was kind of the first reminder that, college football is kind of broken with where it wants to go, but what it is currently. And I think that's a helpful distinction for us, that the NFL is one league. Yes, it has conferences. Yes, it has divisions, but it is very clearly one league with one set of rules. That is not the case in college football.
And I think that's important for people to realize when we compare the Big Ten and the SEC to the AFC and the NFC. The AFC and the NFC are not, like, they do not have somebody running their offices. Like, you have the Big Ten and the SEC offices, right? Like, That is not the way it operates. It is the NFL with two separate, I don't even know what divisions or whatever they're called. That is not the way the Big Ten and the SEC operates. It could be if the NCAA would, do their job. It could be. But that's just not how it operates, because the NCAA does not do anything. I can't stress that enough. They don't do anything.
You might say they stink.
Yeah, they do stink. I know that. Yeah. I have a shirt that says it.
There you go.
Philip says, how long would conference alignment terms be? 6 years, 8 years, 15 years, 25 years? I mean, that would be my question as well, right? Like, I don't think they're going to sign teams to like 2-year deals, right? Like, I couldn't see that happening.
Yeah.
But, say Purdue was just in a 8-year deal. I keep using Purdue. I'm sorry I'm ganging up on them, but they just had a terrible season, so I'm going to use them. Say Purdue just, last 6 years they won, 9 games total, and they just got out of their contract. The Big Ten is not signing them to a large deal. They might not be signing them at all. They might say, let's go get Utah, right? Yeah. Let's go get Arizona State. Kenny Dillingham's there. He's doing a good job now. And let's get into the state of Arizona. They could do that. I think that it goes much, much more than just how many games have you won. But at the same time, that's an easy reason to pick at teams.
Not to disagree, but it's more of a question, is at what point do the school presidents get involved? Because, like, I think what you're saying makes, as much as I don't like it, it makes sense. But there is still the spirit of amateurism, despite the fact that we're not paying players. There's still the spirit of amateurism in academia. I think there's a really good chance that some of these school presidents stand in the way of some of this.
I thought about that as well. I forgot to mention it. There was a lot I had to say, so I forgot to mention it.
Yeah.
I think in this scenario, this is where you see football programs of schools pretty much just like get themselves away from the rest of the school,
Okay.
right? We've already seen football pretty much take itself away from everything else in certain ways, not entirely, but if we get to that point, I mean, 2030 seems like a long way away, but it's really not that long away, and we could see that at that point. We could start to see athletic directors start functioning as, you know, the leaders of those programs, and the presidents are like, okay, that makes sense, but we're still a Big Ten team, maybe with lacrosse and everything else, but when it comes to football, you know, we're an SEC team, we're a Big 12 team, whatever it might be. And again, that would stink. We don't want that, but
yeah,
like Philip's question here, can schools be franchise tagged? Only if they agree to something like that.
Yeah.
That's a good thought. Who would be franchise tagged this year?
Yeah. I think Alabama should be franchise tagged to the Sun Belt.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
They're over the Sun Belt.
Yeah. Kalen DeBoer, that
right.
should be more fair.
A lot to chew on there. I'm sure if more ACC news comes out, we might come back to this. It's a pretty harebrained idea. I don't expect it to exactly go that way, but the main premise of everything that I said was I think we're probably going to see contracts for schools, individual contracts, not for, you know, like not a contract across the board for every school, because it's basically what we have now. We have a membership agreement. Every school has it, right? To see individual contracts for schools with football. I think it's probably trending that way if things don't change. Maybe things change, they get different. But if not, that's what we're looking at.
Well, I think what you are wisely reacting to is I think a lot of people look at changes and think, oh, that'll never happen over here. But the reality is when changes happen, you know, often they set trends. And so I don't know if it'll be a trend that lasts, but I think it might be a trend.
Yeah, the only thing that would save it would be somebody to come in and be the commissioner. Somebody to come in and be an overarching figure.
Yeah.
To me. That's the only thing that could save college football at this point.
JR for commissioner.
No, not me. I would do a terrible job.
You do better than the NCAA.
Wow, they're doing even more terrible than what I would do.
Right, exactly. Let's listen. You be the stopgap, and then we'll
do that. Okay.
Yeah, the interim.
Right. Yeah, and then I'll give it over to Josh Pate or somebody. Actually, no, I don't want to give it to Josh Pate. He'd make the SEC play like 6 conference games. I don't want to give it to him. David Greenshield says, "Hey guys, when is the next call-in show back? Let's talk some ball. This month sometime. Zach and I just need to figure out when to do it this month. So maybe Zach and I can talk after the show or talk sometime this week, and maybe we'll have an answer for you guys on Sunday. So stay tuned. We'll have more info on that. All right, Zach, let's get a commercial. We'll come back. We'll talk about our Big Ten storyline. Stay with us, everybody. Have you ever wanted to watch all 22 film, that film the coaches watch? Well, now you can. Introducing the Coaches Film Room. Over at Minutes to Sports, former college coach Zack Smith breaks down film of the most relevant teams in college football with a bit of a Big Ten lead. It's not free, so you'll need to sign up for the Colonel tier, which is $25 a month, but I can attest to you that it is far more worth it than that. With about 4 to 8 games per week, this is worth so much more money, not to mention Zach's analysis, making you a smarter football fan. Go check it out. The links are in the description, minutestosports.com. You won't be sorry. Back here on the Big Ten Huddle. Please do like and subscribe. We definitely appreciate it when everybody does that. Helps us out, helps the algorithm, and it helps
Mhm.
us defeat those dirty SEC teams and
Mm,
their
mm.
podcasts. So
Get out. Get him out of here.
we rival the SEC podcasts, and there's SEC podcasts out there that are bigger than us, and they're less entertaining than us. They're less good looking than us.
Mm,
I
mm.
mean, I don't know how it happens, but get the likes up, help us out, okay, and
Yeah.
subscribe on all your
Yeah.
devices. Your daughter's device, your son's device, all of them. All right, Zach, we got some 2025 Big Ten storylines. I went a little bit less obvious. You went a little bit more obvious. Part of
Well,
the
no,
reason why I went a little bit less obvious because I didn't want to copy you. But I'm gonna let the more obvious one go first, Zach.
I changed it. I told you I changed it. My number one was Penn State, but I changed it
Okay, all right. Well,
because at the top
give
of the
us an
show.
obvious one, and then give us your real less obvious one. They better
Okay.
not be the same as mine.
No, I think I saw yours.
Okay.
So I have two maybe less obvious ones, but the obvious one is obviously can Penn State duplicate the blueprint that Ohio State set?
And
And
Michigan too. Yeah.
yeah, and Michigan. And I think in that there's several mini storylines. There's I think can Drew Aller actually live up to potential? I think there is, the rematch or the maybe the revenge factor between Jim Knowles and Ohio State. And then I think there's a ton about James Franklin. Can he win top 5 games? Can he beat Ohio State? Can he recapture the Big Ten? Can he actually win the big one and win a national championship? Like I think it's a big storyline because there's actually a lot of smaller storylines that I think are knit within it. I think even how do they replace Abdul Carter, who I think was so dominant? Can this senior class, be like the Ohio State senior class? So there's a lot of mini storylines culminating in that big storyline.
Okay. All right. I only have two, so give one of your less obvious
All
ones.
right. So the less obvious one. So for a while, Northwestern had this very odd pattern under Pat Fitzgerald, where it's like they'd be awful, like 3-9, and then they'd get to a Big Ten championship, and then they'd go, 1-11, and then get to a Big Ten championship, and then David Braun took over. Everybody thought they were going to fall off, and instead they go like I think 8-5.
8-5. Yep. They won the
Eight
bowl game.
five. It won a bowl game, and then they faded a bit last year. I think something I am looking out for, especially looking at their schedule, is do they get back to a bowl game under Preston Stone? Because now, Zach Lujan's been there for a year. David Braun settled. Can they actually remind people that they are more pesky than people realize? And that is, I think, a question I have because every time we assume they're going to be awful, they surprise us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting topic. I have some more on that when we get to the win totals because I thought Northwestern's win total was interesting, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. My first storyline is will veteran QBs, I'm talking, Drew Aller, Luke Altmaier, Dylan Raiola, I'd even put Fernando Mendoza in there, right? He started for Cal. Can veteran QBs outperform the younger, more highly rated first year starters? Now, Drew Aller was a 5-star coming out of high school, but he's not exactly played up to that. And I think people were expecting more for him, fair or not fair. Like that's what people were expecting from him. Luke Altmaier wasn't the highest rated guy coming out of high school, but he has played very well at Illinois. Can he be more than maybe a Julian Sayin, Dante Moore, Bryce Underwood this year? And then Dylan Raiola, can he start being that 5-star that many were expecting him to be? And then Fernando Mendoza, he's looking really good right now in not spring practice. I think he did a pro day. I think that's what John sent me earlier on X. But these guys have a lot of hype going into this season and well deserved. Like they did well for Raiola. He did well at times last year, and for the other guys, they did well at times or for most of the year. It's just you have these young, hot shot kind of guys coming in that are very, very highly rated quarterbacks, and I'm interested to see which group is better. Is it Dante Moore? Is it Julian Sayin? Is it Bryce Underwood? Or is it Luke Altmaier, Drew Aller, Dylan Raiola, and Fernando Mendoza? Before you yell at me, I know Dante Moore started for a little bit of time at UCLA. I'm saying first time starting for Oregon, right? This is his first time going there. Him and Mendoza are kind of the ones on the out there a little bit, just because it's a little bit more iffy in that storyline. But yeah, that's one of my ones.
I think it's a good one. It'll be interesting. There's a lot of hype around Julian Sayin after the combine. And I think he leads that young court, him and Dante Moore, but it'll be interesting to see, because I think a lot of people want the veteran quarterbacks to show that they make a jump, versus I think there's also a lot of anticipation for these young guys. So that's really good.
Yeah. And John says, yeah, he was participating. I used Pro Day and he was throwing bombs. He was. I mean, he was throwing some really, really good passes. I mean, guys weren't breaking strides down the field. So obviously, he needs a good offensive line to help him continue to do that this year. I think Cignetti's done a good job of adding players, but they'll need to stay healthy because they do have a few guys on that offensive line that have been a little bit injury prone in their career. So we'll see. All right, Zach, your next storyline.
Okay, Indiana fans, don't throw things at me through the YouTube live stream. Please don't.
Well, we know you're an Indiana hater.
So. Yes, I am. I'm an Indiana hater. Is Curt Cignetti a one-hit wonder?
Sorry, say that again. I was laughing at David.
No,
say that
again. Is Indiana and Curt Cignetti a one-hit wonder? I think that's a question that's going to be. I think it's not one that necessarily I subscribe to, but I think especially after the playoff and a lot of people, including Kirk Herbstreit, being like, is Indiana really, like, did they deserve to be in? Which they did. They did deserve to be in.
And just to clarify, you're not asking this. You are saying this is a storyline other people are going to have.
Yes, I think this is a storyline that other people are going to have. And I'm preparing Indiana fans, because I could see, especially if they have that first game against Illinois, their first big game against Illinois, and they lose. If they lose, I'm not picking that game yet. I could see that becoming the big story, which I think is bogus, but I think it's going to be I think especially because we saw a couple of good seasons under Tom Allen. I think that's going to be something that is in people's minds. I don't think it's fair, but I think it is going to be a storyline that we're going to have to deal with all season long.
Yeah, it's definitely not fair. There are SEC people foaming at the mouth. I mean, SEC bias media is going to be out there foaming at the mouth. You better believe Peter Burns is going to be making some kind of tweet if Indiana loses to Illinois. He's not going to be making tweets in favor of Illinois. That's what's going to be happening. If Indiana wins that game, we are going to be talking about how good it is for Indiana. We're not going to be questioning Illinois. If Illinois wins that game, we're going to be talking about how good things are for Illinois. We're not going to be questioning Indiana after that game, because these are two teams that are good, have good coaches, brought in good players, and it's going to be a good game. Others are going to look at that game and say, well, the loser here is fraudulent, which is just completely unfair and incorrect. I mean, they could be fraudulent, I suppose. I don't think it's likely. They could be, but the results of that game do not tell us if those two teams, if one of those two teams are fraudulent or not. The result of that game should tell us which team is going to be good next year. It should not tell us which team is going to be fraudulent. But unfortunately, Peter Burns and Kirk Herbstreit and everybody else is going to look at that game and say, this team's fraudulent. The other team, they just beat a fraudulent team. Who cares? And it's unfair, but you're exactly right. That is what they're going to be looking at. Yeah.
And I think the question, I think even with that, underneath that too, is win or lose against Illinois. You don't have an easy road after that. Like, you go at Iowa, bye week, at Oregon, and then you get Michigan State, UCLA, and at Maryland. But I think even part of the question, has Indiana, can Indiana avoid the lull and the trap in year two? So I think there's a lot of questions with Indiana and with Kurt Signetti. I'm not necessarily saying he's a one-hit wonder, but I think that's going to be the question that kind of plagues the program unless they start 8-0 like they did a year ago.
Right. I mean, we did a video on it. We said, is Kirk Cinetti the next Mel Tucker? You and I both disagreed. We both said he's not.
Yeah.
We both said that he has too much success at previous stops. He's too good of a coach. He has too good of a strategy bringing in, players. The question a lot of people are going to ask this year, fair or not fair, and I don't think it's fair, but the question a lot of people are going to ask is he Mike Norvell? Can he bring in a really good transfer portal class and win, but then try to bring in another transfer portal class and doesn't win? I think that's ridiculous. I think that they're going to be at least an 8-win team next year. And I think as long as you win 8 games as Indiana, you feel good. You might not feel great. You'd like to win 10 games, something like that. But you win 8 games next year, you feel good.
Yep. Yeah. David said, I thought you told me Mendoza is a upgrade at quarterback. I'll pull it up here. We canceled each other out there. I do think Mendoza is an upgrade. I think the schedule is even more. It's more of a downgrade. Like
the schedule is much harder this year.
You look at their road slate at Iowa, at Oregon. They didn't have Oregon on the schedule last year. At Penn State, they didn't have Penn State on the schedule last year. And at Maryland, listen, Maryland's. I mean, everybody knows our thoughts on Maryland, but Maryland gets frisky with teams at times. Nobody thought USC was losing to Maryland.
USC is not Indiana. Lincoln Riley is not Cook.
No, but I'm just saying, I don't love that, especially when you have Penn State the week after.
Okay. All right. Okay, you heard it here. If Maryland gives Indiana a good game, you heard it here first.
Yeah.
Fire Loxley. Agreed.
Yes.
Agreed.
Yes. I'm just saying I don't love that. And it's at Maryland and then at Penn State. So they have back-to-back bye, which oddly, that is like a thing for a lot of teams. We have 2 straight road games. And I'm like, why did you schedule I don't understand why the Big Ten scheduled it that way. But
I don't either. It was weird.
Sorry.
All right, so my last storyline, and then we'll get to Big Ten win totals after this. My last storyline is, can the SEC Assassins, that's what I'm going to call them, the SEC Assassins, I'm talking Michigan, USC, Illinois, Ohio State, they all went 6-1 versus the SEC last year. Can the SEC Assassins become Big Ten contenders? None of those 4 teams finished within the top 3 of the Big Ten last year, yet all of them beat SEC teams. In USC's case, they beat 2. In Ohio State's case, they beat 2. Michigan did go 1-1, but that was a game against Alabama where they did not have very many of their starters, first round picks and stuff, and they still beat them. Right? Alabama still had Jalen Milroe. They still had players playing in that game, and Michigan beat them. So I think they deserve credit for that. Can the SEC Assassins, any of them, become Big Ten contenders this year? That's my storyline.
Yeah. I mean, I think yes. I mean,
one of them has to, right? One of them has to be a top 3 team in the Big Ten.
Yeah. I mean, so you said Ohio State, Michigan,
Illinois, Michigan, Ohio State. Ohio State, Michigan, USC, Illinois.
I would say the only one that doesn't have a shot is USC.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say they don't have a shot. I think it's very unlikely, but I wouldn't say they don't have a shot.
Yeah, that less than a 50% shot is USC.
I think USC could possibly, not saying it's likely, not saying I'm picking it to happen, not saying I want it to happen. That's not fair. I don't really care. I think USC could lose 2 or less games in the Big Ten this season. Again, not predicting it, but it could happen.
I think, yeah. No, I
they
don't
have
think
enough talent. They have good enough coaches. Like Lincoln Riley's done it before in conferences. Maybe not the Big Ten, but he's done it before. Like, it could happen.
And the schedule's not awful.
Yeah.
It's not murderer's row like it was a year ago.
Yeah.
Goodness.
I mean, Illinois legitimately has a schedule that could get them in the Big Ten title game.
Yep.
Again,
Yeah.
I'm not going to predict that to happen. I mean, maybe I will. I don't know. Right now, I'm not predicting that
Yeah.
to happen,
I,
but it could happen.
I, I just want to push on something though, because you're saying like none of these teams were in the top 3 of the Big Ten. Ohio State won the national championship. So, like, I get that they're
I know, but I'm
fourth.
saying Big Ten contender here. I'm not saying national championship
But
contender.
I
Zach.
think everybody sees Ohio State as a Big Ten contender.
Listen to my words, okay? They are very technical for a reason.
I am, but I think that's a little bit of a, I don't know. There's some it's a shooting fruit or something. There's
Zach,
some stuff there.
There were 3 teams who had 1 or less losses in the Big Ten last year. Was Ohio State one of them?
That's fair. No, they weren't. They had 2.
I will say Ohio State produced the only losses of those top 3 teams, but still. Let me have my words here, Zach.
No, it's fair. It's fair.
Anything else on storylines before we move to win totals?
I mean, there's so many bigger ones that we haven't addressed, but
I'm sure we'll get to them. But
yeah.
All right, we're gonna hit commercial really fast. You guys are gonna learn about home field, and then we'll come back and do win totals. Be right back. Home Field is your go-to destination for premium collegiate apparel with a passion for comfort and a flair for vintage design. Home Field brings you gear that is comfortable and stylish. With over 150 colleges to choose from, Home Field digs deep into the archives, uncovering forgotten logos, iconic mascots, and legendary moments to create one-of-a-kind apparel. Use my code TBTH for 15% off for new customers, or use my link in the description. Back here on the Big Ten Huddle. We appreciate you being here. We're talking Big Ten win totals. If you miss an episode live, do not forget you can always catch it on podcasts. And, give us a 5-star rating while you're over there, whether it's Apple, Spotify, wherever you can give a 5-star rating at. Please do so. Helps, again, just like liking, it helps other people know about the podcast and helps us beat out those dirty SEC podcasters. We just want to take care of business there. So, all right. And David, I do apologize. It says, JR, did you really need to remind us? Again, it worked. It worked for my wording. Okay. That's just, I really stuck with the wording there. So, that's all I'll say. So sorry, David, didn't mean to ruin your night. All right. Zach, Big Ten win totals for 2025. All right. If everybody can see them over here on my side, if you're listening on podcast, I will tell them to you really fast, and then we will ask Zach about if the Big Ten is top heavy or not. Illinois sits at 7-5, Indiana 8-5, Iowa 7-5, Maryland 4-5, 4.5. I say 7-5. Let me start over. Illinois at 7.5. Indiana 8.5, Iowa 7.5, Maryland 4.5, Michigan 8.5, Michigan State 5.5, Minnesota 6.5, Nebraska 7.5, Northwestern 3.5, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State all 10.5. Then you have Purdue 3.5. You have Penn State at, I apologize, Rutgers at 5.5, UCLA at 4.5, USC at 7.5, Washington at 7.5, and then Wisconsin at 5.5. Zach, is the Big Ten top heavy? They have 3 10.5 win total teams, 0 9.5 win total teams, and only 2 8.5 win total teams. It's kind of crazy. It's a little bizarre. Is the Big Ten a top heavy team or conference?
To some degree, right? I mean, they were a little top heavy last year too. Like if you think about, you had the top 4, and I think you had Illinois at 5, and then 6 through I think 13. We were always trying to figure out how do we sort these teams. So I think there is a messy middle in the conference. I think there might be a little bit more movement upward. Like Philip was like Illinois at 7.5 is laughable. We'll get to that. I would actually argue though that I think a couple teams are wrong on the top end. And I'll start with Ohio State. I think 10.5, like I think if you bet the over on 10.5 for Ohio State, I think you're losing money because you're asking them to win 11 games essentially. And they got to play Texas. They've got to play Penn State. They got to play Michigan. And then they have a road game at Washington. They have road game at Illinois. And that pairs with a road game at Camp Randall, which I know Wisconsin has not been very good, But again, dual road games at Illinois and at Wisconsin, like, and that's a rough stretch for them. They have to go to Washington 2 weeks before they go to Illinois. So I don't love that. I don't love Oregon at 10 and a half. Like, they have to go to Penn State. They have to travel to Iowa. They have to travel to Washington. It's not a murderer's row schedule, but I just don't love that, especially with all that they lost and the quarterback transition, as good as Dante Moore might be. And so, like, if you're asking me, are they top heavy and is like, are they going to rule the roost? I'm not sure, because while I do think Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State are the top 3 teams, like, I think Michigan's going to be better. I think Illinois is going to be better. I think Indiana is really interesting. And then, like, USC, Washington, even Wisconsin, Nebraska, like, all those teams, Minnesota, like, they have talent. So, like, I don't want to sit here and say there's going to be a clear hierarchy. I think Penn State will have, a really good season. I think Ohio State could have a really good season. I think Oregon could have a really good season. But I'm not convinced that it's going to be a couple of, like, 11-1 teams and everybody else has 9 wins or fewer.
Yeah, I think we'll get to too high and too low here in a second. I think that this was very lazy of whoever the sports books are. I think if you know the Big Ten well enough, and I personally don't bet, but if you are a person who bets, if you wanted to right now, you could go over to FanDuel and make yourself a lot of money. And I know people will say, well, Vegas knows better. I get that. But like you just said, Ohio State and Oregon are both replacing quarterbacks this year. Mm-hmm. It is very likely that these teams are still very talented and very good teams. Ohio State won 10 games last year, and they had an all-star team of contributors, right? That defensive line is going to be brand new for Ohio State. And they don't have a super easy schedule. They go to Washington. They have Texas at home. They go to Illinois. They go to Wisconsin. They have Penn State. They go to Michigan. Like, to me, if Ohio State gets 10 wins, that's a success. You make yourself back into the playoffs. Mm-hmm. Anything above 10 wins, you're ecstatic about. Do I think that Ohio State will win 10 games? Yeah, I think they probably will. 9 is probably their floor, but I think they'll probably win 10 games. But that's a very difficult schedule for them to get through, especially when you have at Washington, home against Minnesota, at Illinois, at Wisconsin. Yeah. Many people are going to look at that and say, well, Ohio State should beat all those teams. Correct. They should. But Illinois is going to be much better this season. Wisconsin is never an easy trip with that home field advantage they have there. And then Washington has the longest winning streak, home winning streak in the nation. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as tough as it was for Washington last year, they still went undefeated at home, won all 6 games at home. So to me, like, even though I'm an Ohio State fan, even though, I drink the Ohio State Kool-Aid and all that stuff, I try to remain objective here. And if I'm remaining objective, 9-10 wins for Ohio State is much more likely than an 11 next season.
Can I, they might have been lazy or they might have been brilliant, because I think a lot of casuals will look at Ohio State and be like, well, they just won the national championship. They're going to win. They're going to win 11 games. I'll bet the over. And I think same thing with Oregon. I think this is a helpful distinction. A lot of sports books are looking for suckers.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that's the difficulty of win totals, is they tell you, they set a context. But I think we know the Big Ten well enough to be like, do not bet I don't bet, but don't bet those. Like, you'll lose your money if you go. Like, I would almost, I wouldn't say guarantee, but I feel like it's very easy for Ohio State to hit the under there. I think it's fair, not really easy, but I feel fairly confident that Oregon will also hit the under. Penn State has an easier schedule, but they still have Oregon and Ohio State and they have to go to Iowa, and they have to play Nebraska. Like, I
Yeah.
it's not a cakewalk for any of those teams to get to 11 wins.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think that although this does make the Big Ten look a bit like a top-heavy conference, you look over at the SEC, they have 0 teams with a win total of higher than 9.5. Texas is playing Ohio State this season. Georgia is at 9.5. They're most likely going to be starting either Gunnar Stockton or some other brand new quarterback this year. Like, if you look at win totals only and try to figure out who are the contenders this season based on win totals, the Big Ten has 3 contenders this year. The SEC has, I think, 5 teams at 9.5 this year. Like, they could have a contender out of there. They could have 2, maybe 3 out of there, but it's much more likely to find a contender with a 10.5 win total than one with a 9.5. And so 1 or 2 of those teams is going to flop. It only wins 7 games. It's just the way it is. That's the way these things work out. But also 1 or 2 of those teams is going to excel and win 10, 11 games. So
yeah,
just how the things work out.
I'm surprised. Okay. Georgia isn't more than 9.5.
Yeah. I mean, I think the quarterback situation is huge. You know, you see the way Gunnar Stockton played in that game. Like, Philip said Florida contender. No, I think Florida's at like 6.5. I don't think they're a contender.
Yeah.
They're a contender for a bowl game.
Yeah. I feel like Vegas is looking for suckers.
Yeah.
But to be fair, I think there's probably enough deep pockets in the South that are like, they see Georgia's schedule and they're like, that's probably not. Although, I don't know, looking at their schedule, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm not showing enough respect to Alabama or Ole Miss, but that schedule, it looks hard, but I don't think it's. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, let's give some thoughts on. We kind of talked around it a little bit. Let's be a little bit more structured here. What teams are let's do too low first. We do too high and we're going to make people mad and they're going to leave. Let's do too low first. Let's make the people happy first. What win totals do you feel like are too low? I'll give you my locks first, and then if you have any others that you feel like are too low. I think my locks for too low are Illinois. That's number 1. Minnesota, I actually think is too low. I think this is a team that's shown they're going to win more than 6 games most times. I mean, all they have to do is get to 7 wins. You're telling me Minnesota can't get 7 wins out of Buffalo, FCS team, Cal, Rutgers. I mean, Ohio State's on there. Purdue, Nebraska, Iowa, Michigan State, Oregon, Northwestern, Wisconsin. You're telling me they can't get 7 wins out of that schedule? Like,
yeah.
I do think Cal is going to be a little difficult because at Cal, so I do think that needs to be taken into consideration. But like, I see Minnesota winning 7 or 8 games next year.
Yeah. I think that's very, very, very fair.
Yeah, Illinois 9, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that range, all above 7.5. So they're my biggest lock for somebody that's too low, and the Northwestern as well. We talked about it. Like, I don't know. Like, I refuse to believe that David Braun had that first season, and the only teams he's going to beat this year are Western Illinois, Louisiana, and Purdue. Like, I just refuse to believe he's only going to win those 3 games. I think he probably gets, I don't know, UCLA, Tulane, Minnesota. I mean, I think he gets one of those 3. I'm not predicting any of those 3, but I think he gets one of those 3 and gets Northwestern to at least 4 wins.
I think that's a good. I think that's a good sleeper pick for sure.
Okay, you give if you have any locks, and then I have 2 teams I'm kind of questionable on that I want to talk about.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any locks other than what you said. I'll say a couple teams that I'm questionable on. One is UCLA. I think, you look at the first 3 games, like Utah was not great last year. I think they have a puncher's chance there at home. And then it's UNLV and New Mexico. If they go 3-0 to start the season, they need 2 more wins to beat the win total. And they go to Northwestern, Penn State at home, at Michigan State, Maryland at home, at Indiana, Nebraska at Ohio State, Washington at USC. So tough schedule. But Washington at home is possible. Nebraska at home is possible. Maryland at home is definitely possible. And then Michigan State and Northwestern, like, I would probably favor UCLA in both those games. So like I think it's questionable because I still think I'm curious about just how they'll respond in year 2 with Deshaun Foster. I think Rutgers is another questionable one. They start their first 3 games, they should win easy. I think the game that really defines their season is that 4th game with Iowa at home. Like, can they spring what will probably be an upset at home? If they do, I think they get to 6 wins in a bowl game and they hit the over.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I really liked you bringing up UCLA. I thought UCLA was a good topic there with how much they've brought in through the portal. Deshaun Foster getting his feet under him. Tino Sinceri, I think, is either going to be boom or bust. If he's boom, this is a really, really interesting team next year who could get to 7 or 8 wins. I think the schedule allows them to do that. You have Maryland, Northwestern, New Mexico, UNLV, Washington at home, like you said. Like it allows them to get there. But Tino Sinceri, and maybe Joey Aguilar is just something else, right? Like 2 years ago at App State, he was fantastic. Last year, he just wasn't great. He led his team to 6-6. He still threw the ball over a yard, but still. I'm not going to trust a quarterback that went 6-6 in the Sun Belt to come to the Big Ten and win 7 games. Could happen. Tino Sinceri is a really good quarterback coach, but
yeah,
I'm going to need to see it before I believe it.
Right.
Terry says his locks are Washington and Indiana. We'll get to Indiana here in a second. I think Indiana has a very interesting win total. Washington, I think they're probably 7 or 8 wins. I think that's actually a pretty decent win total there. What do you think, Zack?
Yeah, and I think my hesitation with Washington is I didn't love what I saw from Jedd Fisch this past year. And so from Terry, if we're talking talent, I think you're onto something.
Yeah, I think Demond Williams is going to be really good. They have a good secondary, but what is Jedd Fisch going to do with him?
Yeah, and if you look at Jedd Fisch was awful in close games last year. And so I want to see more. I don't feel like I can trust Jedd Fisch yet at Washington.
Yeah, trust him at home. One of the teams at home. But they also play Washington State on the road again.
Yeah.
That was a neutral site game last year. It's a road game this year. When is Jedd Fisch going to win a game that they're not playing at home?
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to be that Washington game? Who knows? I think so. I think they'll beat Washington State, but I don't know. All right, let's make some people mad now, Zack. Teams that are too high. We already talked about Ohio State. That has the possibility. I think Ohio State, I would feel better if they had a 9.5 win total, not because of the team, but just because of that schedule. I think that they're probably 9 or 10 wins. I lean 10 just because of the consistency of the program, and they've won double-digit games every year since that terrible Luke Fickell year. And, COVID doesn't count. They didn't play 10 games that year.
Right.
So, this has been a very consistent program. I trust them to win 10, but I would also not be surprised if they will only win 9 just because of that schedule. What are there any other teams you feel like are too high before we talk about other ones?
Oh man. There's a couple that I'm maybe a little nervous about. So Iowa, their win total 7.5. they
You
have to
talk to
play.
Iowa fans though, and they think that they're going to be better this year than they were last year.
Yeah, well, and we thought they could be a playoff team a year ago, and they were very close to being 7-5 instead. So I like they have to play on the road against Iowa State. They play on the road at Rutgers, and we've seen like Rutgers at home at times has
Rutgers at
been
home is good.
tricky. They have to play in. They have to play Indiana. I mean, they play them at home. And they have to play Penn State and Oregon at home. I forget who I was listening to. It might have been Kings of the North. Penn State has been better at Iowa than at home against Iowa.
Mm.
So, like, as good as that home field advantage has been for Iowa, it has not been great for Penn State. They got to play. They got to play Minnesota. We think Minnesota is going to be good. They have to go on the road to Southern Cal, which they have beat Southern Cal the last time they played them. So it's not like that's a definite loss. And then they have to go on the road to Nebraska, which I know Nebraska hasn't beaten Iowa in a while. But if Nebraska makes the 3-year jump like we think they might, I don't know. That's a lot of question marks for me for Iowa. And I don't like they lost their bell cow. And like as much as we're talking about the quarterback, who are they throwing the ball to?
I mean, they do return their receivers, and I think their receivers are going to develop. Like Tim Lester has shown that players, I think, on the offense are going to get better, unlike under Brian Ferentz, that is. So I do think they're going to get better, but I don't think I don't think it's wrong to say prove it. You know?
Yeah.
Like. So.
Yeah. Do you want me to say the other one so you don't have to?
No, it's fine. I mean, I just wonder about Indiana. Like,
yeah,
I actually think 8.5 is a good win total for Indiana. I could see 7.5, but I think 8.5 is more enticing just because of who they have on their schedule. Like, they have Penn State, at Oregon, at Iowa, home against Illinois. I think all 4 of those games are games you can lose, right? And then the other piece of it is how many times do we see teams like this isn't just an Indiana thing. This is a college football thing. How many times do we see teams go 2 straight years of winning every game they're supposed to win? On this schedule, there are 8 games that Indiana is supposed to win. To me, they should at least have 8 wins this year. But how many times do we see that every single year that happen? We don't. We don't see that very often. Indiana could very well do it, but as far as I'm concerned, like you're going to have to expect Indiana to win all of those games, which they should, and then you're going to have to expect them to get one of at Penn State, at Oregon, at Iowa, or Illinois. At Iowa is probably the most likely one there, but Iowa is still not an easy place to go play at. And that's early enough in the season. How are things going to be gelling together? How are things going? Right? I believe in Indiana, right? I don't want to be labeled an Indiana hater after this, that like, JR doesn't think they're good. But I just know college football, and I just know that teams, doing the exact same thing they did last year, it doesn't happen super often. There are very few teams in the nation that can come out and do something the exact same as they did last year. See our analysis on Ohio State. See our analysis on Oregon.
Yep.
We both said that it's possible they get under their win totals. Not saying we're going to predict it, but it's possible.
Yeah. I think there's one more that I'm curious your take on. And it's Michigan. So their win total is 8.5.
You didn't have any thoughts on Indiana? I went through all that. You didn't have any thoughts on Indiana?
Oh, I thought you did a great job. So I was like,
okay.
All right. No.
Michigan.
I'll go to India. I'll go back to India. I think it is interesting. One of the schedule quirks about Indiana, they play at Oregon after a bye, and Oregon also has a bye. But Oregon is coming off a game against Penn State. Indiana's coming off against a game against Iowa. It's just I'm curious what that game's going to look like. I think Autson's probably going to be too much for Indiana, but I don't know. It's just an interesting. It's interesting to me, that game, especially with how much Oregon has to replace.
Yeah.
So
No, I think you're right. I think it's very interesting. I think that Signetti with time is is going
yeah,
to do well. But
yeah, yeah,
what'd you say? Oregon has a bye before that too. Like Dan Lanner's going
yeah,
to have time too. So
yeah,
what are we going to see there? I think it's going to be really
yeah,
interesting to look at, especially with Oregon at home.
yeah,
So
yeah.
all right. So you said Michigan. What were you talking about with Michigan?
So Michigan's total's 8.5, and as much as we like to slam the SEC, they have to go to Norman, Oklahoma. And
Early in the season, I think is the key there.
yeah, exactly. Like, so whoever your quarterback is, even if it's Mikey Keene, who is a veteran, he's not a veteran on Michigan's team. He's a veteran, like he has to learn a system. And if it's Underwood, you want to talk about throwing the kitchen sink at a young guy, like that's what Venables is going to do. And so you have to deal with that. You then have to go to Nebraska, which is also another very good defense. And then bye week, Wisconsin at USC. So you got to travel. By the way, at Norman, at Nebraska, at USC, all within the first 7 weeks of the season. That's a lot, especially for a new quarterback, a brand new defense, which I know they did great in the bowl game in a monsoon, right?
Yeah.
I'm just, it's a little hairy. And then I know that they have a four straight on Ohio State, but like that's still going to be that's going to be a really tough game for them. Yeah, like, and if they lose 4, they go under. So I wouldn't say it's definite, but I think it might be a little high.
I think Michigan's schedule is much more favorable this year than it was last year. I agree with you. The at Oklahoma, at Nebraska, at USC, and I think even at Michigan State there deserves being talked about because it's a rivalry game.
Yep.
But we're also looking at a situation where all 4 of these teams need to greatly improve from last year. Not so much Nebraska. I think that they showed it at the beginning of the year. It's just which team are they going to be? Are they going to be the team that, was the second half of the season, or are they going to be the team that was the first half of the season? I tend to believe they'll be the team that's the first half of the season, but I've also said that about Nebraska before, and they disappointed me before. So
yeah,
I'm not gonna buy the Nebraska Kool-Aid that much until they prove it to me.
right.
But I do think like if they had Bryce Underwood starting in his second year, I'd say Michigan over 8.5 easy.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's Bryce Underwood's first year, Mikey Keene could be the starter. You could have Bryce Underwood breathing down his neck. From everything we're hearing, Bryce Underwood's the guy, and they're probably going to start him from like all that kind of stuff we're hearing. But we also heard that was going to happen with Alex Orji all offseason, and then Davis Warren started the first game. So, who knows what to believe there. And then Davis Warren had guys breathing down his neck and never really seemed like he was able to get going. So
Yep.
I tend to believe Michigan will go over the 8.5, probably 9 wins. I don't know if I see them losing, that many. But also I would not be surprised to see them go 7-5 again.
Yeah.
Because they very well could lose to Oklahoma, Nebraska, USC, Michigan State, and Ohio State.
Yep. Yeah.
It's very possible.
Yeah. I think it's there. It's not like it's so high. It's just, there's a lot of question marks.
Yeah. You look at the schedule and they should be over.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at the context of it all, and it's like, and maybe this is where they get right. Maybe this is where they get people. You look at it, Michigan, and you say, "Oh, should be over." But
Yep.
if you know what you're doing, you know the context. It's much more questionable.
Yeah. This is switching. You know what? I think it's something that's sad. Wisconsin's win total 5.5, and you look at the schedule, and you're like,
it's almost too high.
Yeah. And you're like, man, what have they done? Like, what has Luke Fickell done? And part of it, I don't know if Paul Chryst would have been able to do well with this schedule either. Like, it's a brutal schedule. But I also think, like, I think under Paul Chryst, you would assume, and this is no offense to Indiana or Illinois or Minnesota, but you just kind of assume, oh, they'd win those games.
Right.
but I don't like. I could see them going over in the last 4 weeks of the season, which is insane.
I have 2 guaranteed wins on their schedule. That's it.
Yeah, it's the first 2.
Right. Maryland, they should win,
Yep.
but it's not a guarantee. Wisconsin, or not Wisconsin, they are Wisconsin. Washington, they should win, but it's by no means a guarantee just because it's at home, but it's still not a guarantee.
Yeah.
I mean, even if they win those 4 games, that's 4 wins. Like,
Yeah. I'd say 4.5 actually might be the better number.
that's what I was saying. Like 5.5 is actually too high,
Yeah.
which is crazy.
Yeah.
But that's the schedule that Luke Fickell has this year. Like, and I don't know, like the way Minnesota looked last year against them, like, and then it's at Minnesota. Like you squandered that opportunity last year by losing to Minnesota at home.
Yeah.
Now you have to go to Minnesota this year. Like,
yeah.
So,
It's honestly, it's a savvy. Again, sports books are looking for suckers. A lot of people are going to look at Wisconsin and be like, they won't miss a bowl game for 2 years in a row. Like, and they're setting it. I think if they set it at 4.5, I think they'd get, well, no, now that I'm talking out loud, I'm like, they actually should have set it for 4.5 because I think a lot of people would have bet it over, and they actually might lose out on that.
Yeah, that's true. Let's do this really fast, and then we'll get out of here. 5 win totals that are too high or too low. Let's agree on 5, and then we'll get out of here. I think we both agree on Wisconsin too high.
Yep. I think we both agree on Ohio State.
Let's try to do some other ones. I'm okay with making I don't want to make them my second one. Illinois too low.
Yes. Yeah. Too low.
We agree Northwestern too low.
Yeah, I think too low.
Okay. We probably need another too high.
I think we said
probably either Oregon or Ohio State, one of those two.
Yeah. I'd go Ohio. I'd probably pick Ohio State over Oregon at this point.
I'll go with that. Ohio State.
And then
last one let's do a 2.
Did you do Minnesota? Did you do Minnesota yet?
No, we did Illinois and Northwestern.
I would Minnesota. It's too low.
Minnesota or Michigan State? We didn't talk about Michigan State.
But we both agreed on Minnesota, right? That they're too low.
We did. I'm just asking. I'm making things really fast.
We didn't talk about Michigan State. So here's the problem with Michigan State is I feel like I don't have a good handle on them because I'm like I buy Jonathan Smith, but I also don't feel like they've done a ton to make me have confidence.
Philip, I can't do Indiana and Ohio State too high. Are you crazy? I mean, this is me we're talking about here. Okay. Well, you might be right. I can't do it. It won't let me. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Oh man. Anyway, I
acknowledge my bias. I'm not gonna act like I don't have a bias.
Good. That's what the SEC people don't do. They don't acknowledge their bias. But no, Michigan State is probably where they need to be just because I don't know.
I do think for Michigan State, Maryland, Youngstown State, Western Michigan are all 3 for sure wins. Boston College should be another win. You get them at home this year. That should be a 4th win. If you're guaranteed 4 wins, which Boston College is probably not a guarantee, but it's a should win. If you're guaranteed 4 wins and your win total is 5.5, like they can't be 1-8 in the Big Ten, right? Like they're bringing back Aiden Childs. They have wide receivers. They got better offensive linemen than last year. I think they revamped that secondary. Like, I mean, Michigan State they can't be 1-8 in the Big Ten.
They could be.
I mean, they could, but I mean, they have to be at least 3-6. Like UCLA.
The more we're talking about it, the more I think it's too high. Because I'm like. Because I see 5 like potentially 5 wins.
I see 4 for sure wins. I see 5 probably wins. It's just that 6 win. Where does it come from? At Iowa, at Minnesota, at Nebraska, at USC. Do they steal any of those road games?
I don't
At
think
Indiana.
so.
Sorry.
No, I don't think so. I think they're. Yeah, I think that's a rough for them. It's a rough schedule, and until they prove otherwise.
Okay.
To me.
Okay. All right. We'll agree on Minnesota then. So our locks are Illinois too low, Wisconsin too high, Northwestern and
Too
Minnesota too low, and Ohio State too high.
I think this is a good list.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go watch some basketball
Sounds good.
because I have a basketball shoot to do at 11, and Burke is coming on, and I don't want to make Burke be the only one that talks about basketball. I should probably talk about it as well.
There you go. There you go.
So, anything else to get to before you got to hear, Zack?
I just hope you're talking about an Ohio State win, and right now it's not looking great. So
they were tied last time I looked over. Were they not tied anymore?
They're still tied, but
okay.
They shouldn't be tied with Nebraska.
You're just pessimistic. You're just pessimistic.
Do you know? Okay. No,
Jake Diebler's got this. I don't know what you're talking. We need some hoops talk from you really fast, Zach. What's your analysis on the Big Ten this year in basketball?
My analysis is Tom Izzo is Tom Izzo.
Wow. Okay.
And Jake Diebler is a young coach who needs to develop, and that's about it.
So you're not on the Fire Diebler crowd. You're not on the Fire Diebler crowd yet.
No, I'm not sure we should have hired Diebler, but I think if you're going to hire him. I said that
at the beginning.
Yeah. But I think if you're going to hire him, he's done some things that Holtman has not done or did not do. But like if the same thing happens where like, you know, he had a lead against Nebraska and then they collapse last minute like they have the past few games, then I'll be like, I give him another year. But then it might be time to say goodbye. So
there you go. That's your hoops segment with Zack Guggenheim.
You don't want me on hoops.
Don't worry. We have Burke on hoops after these games are finished. Come check us out 11 o'clock over on the basketball channel. Only streaming Big Ten After Dark over on the basketball channel now. So if you want to check that out, link is in the description for the basketball channel. We'll see you over there. Zack and I will be back on Sunday night together. I'll try to make a few videos this week. Probably going to be focusing mostly on basketball, but I'll try to put out at least a couple football videos in addition to that. So thank you everybody for being here. See you next time. Have a good one.